Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to LSE for this public event. This event is sponsored by the Financial Markets Group. My name is Daniel Ferreira, and I'm a professor of finance here at LSE, and also a member of FMG. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to LSE. Today we'll hear Alex Edmans speaking to us about his newest book, May Contain Lies, How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It. So first, a few announcements I was told to make. Okay, so Alex will speak for about 35 minutes, after which we will be taking questions from the floor. The book is available for purchasing here tonight, and Alex will be signing copies after the lecture. For the Twitter or X users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Alex Edmans. We also have a photographer present to capture the event, and a selection of photos will be made available on our website, which means that if for any reason you do not want to be in the images that will be published, please let us know after the event, okay? And finally, I was also told to say that there is no fire drill scheduled for today, so if you hear the alarm, it's the real thing. So please leave the building calmly via the marked exits, and we're all going to be fine. Now, let me. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. I've known Alex for a long time, and it's my honor to introduce him to you. So Alex is a professor of finance at London Business School, but that hardly describes him. It would be easier for me to list all the things that Alex hasn't done than to enumerate all of his achievements, but let me try just an incomplete list. So Alex has a PhD from MIT and was previously a tenure professor at Wharton and an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. He has spoken at the World Economic Forum, testified in the UK Parliament, and has given very popular TED Talks. He serves as a non-executive director of the Investment Forum, and he sits on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Responsible Investing, also on the Royal London Asset Management's Responsible Investment Advisory Committee, and on Novo Nordisk's Sustainability Advisory Council. He's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Academy of Social Sciences. And some of you may have read his previous book, which was called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And this book was a Financial Times Book of the Year and has been translated into 9 languages. And I wouldn't be surprised if Alex has translated some of them himself, because he speaks multiple languages. And he's also the co-author of a very famous textbook in corporate finance, Principles of Corporate Finance, with Briley, Myers, and Allen. He has won no less than 26 teaching awards at Wharton and LBS, and was named Professor of the Year by Poets and Quants in 2021. Now, so Alex knows that as fellow academics, we don't really care about any of these achievements. What matters is the quality of your academic papers. So Alex's papers have been published in the leading journals in finance and economics and have been cited, last time I counted, more than 19,000 times. So Alex has made significant contributions to many areas, in particular to corporate governance and sustainable finance. So Alex is a true academic heavyweight and leader in the field, which makes it even harder for me to accept his other achievements. But tonight it's about the book. So I read the book. I strongly recommend it. There are many fascinating stories and bits of wisdom in there. For example, I've learned that there is no reliable evidence that breastfeeding increases IQ. So there goes one of my excuses. Okay? I always wonder how much more intelligent I would have been if I had been breastfed. So now I know the answer, not more intelligent than I am now and probably be the same. So I can no longer blame my mom for my own failures, okay? It's not really her fault. I mean, she had no choice.
But I also know why, despite having practiced the bass guitar for way over 10,000 hours, I'm still not very good at it. Anyway, you're not here to listen to me. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex Edmans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that warm welcome. It's really great to be here. Thank you for, after long days at work or studying, you've decided to come here and to share an hour with me. And so in addition to all the things that Daniel mentioned, he kind of didn't mention that I was a visiting lecturer at LSE earlier this year, taught Finance 300 to undergraduates, so it's great to be back and to have this opportunity to share my work. So this is a book about data and evidence and statistics. And for me, as a finance professor, data and statistics was my life until my son, Casper, was born. So the birth of a child is an overwhelming event, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. And for us, it was quite uneventful because we were lucky the birth went quite smoothly. And then we brought him home and we had to look after this little guy. And the big question is what to feed him. Now, that was something with a seemingly obvious question because of data and evidence. So my wife and I had taken a course with the National Childbirth Trust, extremely well recommended and well respected in the UK. And a lot of the course was on really important practical tips, like how to change a nappy, what to do if your baby is sick. But there were 2 classes exclusively devoted to breastfeeding. And much of this was on how to breastfeed, how to ensure a good latch. But they started by explaining why breastfeed. And the idea is that breastfeeding is tough, and if you could just be convinced of the benefits, then if you were exhausted and willing to jack it in, you would persevere because you knew how big those benefits were. And what are those benefits? Well, apparently, breastfeeding is linked with a huge range of outcomes. So physical outcomes for the child, mental outcomes for the child, physical outcomes from the mother as she recovers from a difficult birth. And this was supported by data and evidence from none other than the World Health Organization. You can get no better than that for a matter of health. And what they recommended was exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. And by exclusive, they did mean exclusive, without water, without any other fluids. The only thing that you were to give was breast milk. And this was supported by references and footnotes, so we knew it had to be true. And so because of this, well, my wife and I had a clear plan. We would exclusively breastfeed Casper for 6 months, and then he'd be cleverer than everybody else in his nursery group. And why stop at 6 months? So we breastfeed him for 16 months. He could be a genius and co-author some papers and help me with my research. So that was our really clear plan. But we thought, well, let's not just take our word for it because, okay, this could be a selected study. So let me now use my investigational skills as a professor. Now, they were pretty basic when it comes to something non-finance, but I did know how to use Google. And obviously, there's many things that you care about in terms of outcomes, but being an academic nerd, I care about IQ more than whether he's going to be a professional footballer. So I looked this up. Is there a link between breastfeeding and IQ? And there was, and from reliable sources. So the BBC says breastfeeding is linked to higher IQ. If I scroll down the page, I find more and more articles of the same kind. And if I come back another day, I also find something similar. More breastfed kids have higher IQs than non-breastfed kids. So that was our plan, exclusive breastfeeding. But then we encountered a really famous breastfeeding expert. His name is Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson said everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So what was the punching in the face for us? It was that breastfeeding just didn't always work. Right? Even if we had a good latch, Casper would drain my wife dry and he was still hungry. So in the first few days, the mother only produces colostrum, which is a precursor to breast milk. And so in this case, what do? You might think, well, it's a no-brainer. If you've got a starving baby, you need to feed him formula. But you might think it's a no-brainer the other way. Why? Because if the World Health Organization says exclusive breastfeeding, feed him nothing. And part of parenting is sometimes not to give in when your children are crying all the time. So I thought, well, this is not clear. Let me use my actual skills as a researcher more than just relying on Google, and let me actually check the underlying evidence. So let me click on the article, because we know about these things about fake news. Maybe Google was making a mistake. Maybe it never said this. So let me click. Well, there was no mistake. So the article did say exactly what Google suggested. But the eagle-eyed among you might notice one sentence down, it says, because of the small sample size, we could not confirm the significant difference between breastfed and bottle-fed kids. So in plain English, the difference was so small, it could just be due to luck. And then if you look at the top, it gets even worse. It says if a different study of 5,500 children, breastfeeding had no significant effect on intelligence. And this was surprising to us, because everybody tells you breast is best. You hear this from doctors and pediatricians and nurses. You are told you should be exclusively breastfeeding. So let me look at the evidence. So footnote 18 says a study in the British Medical Journal. So I was a bit scared because I might have long words and I don't understand this as a finance person if they're going to give me some medical words. But I was brave enough to click on it and I headed straight for the numbers because I'm more comfortable with that. And so what the numbers showed is the following. They looked at comparing breastfed and bottle-fed kids in terms of their IQ. This AT is a bit like an aptitude test. And the difference was about 5 IQ points. So that is not large, it's not massive, but it's not small either. If I can change my child's IQ by 5 points just by changing the feeding method, that is something to take seriously. But also some of you will notice there's a word here which is unadjusted. So what does unadjusted mean? Why might you need to adjust for other things? It's because whether a kid is breastfed or bottle-fed is not random. It depends on other factors. So breastfeeding is tough. It's tough to do without family support. So maybe the babies who are breastfed had a more supportive home environment, and that home environment allowed them to breastfeed, but it also led to all of the better outcomes. Or maybe when the mother goes back to work, if she is an executive who works in an office, they might have a pumping room so she can pump milk and a fridge to store it. If you're working in a factory or as a cleaner moving between houses, you don't have that option. So again, it may well be that the type of job the mother has is correlated with breastfeeding, but also drives the outcomes. And so what the study then did was it controlled for other factors. So what does that mean in plain English? They stripped out the effect on IQ of these other factors, the mother's education, family poverty, the mother's own IQ, the mother's age, and after stripping out all of that other stuff, we're left with peanuts. We're left with 0.52, half an IQ point, which is so small it is not statistically significant. So this is really powerful. Right, the idea that breast is best is so strong, it sometimes guilt trips mothers into thinking that they're not a good mother if they think about reaching for the bottle. And similarly, it may be that fathers are not able to help out and to lead to more equal division of parental responsibilities because of this evidence. And since the book came out, I've had some nice emails about how people liked it, but the one email which really moved me is from a woman who's currently pregnant, but because she had breast cancer, she had a double mastectomy. So she will not be able to breastfeed. She will be delivering her baby at a US hospital linked to a major Ivy League university. So you might think they should know about evidence, and they tell her, we are not providing any resources to help you because we're only going to focus on breastfeeding because the evidence is so strong. We don't recommend bottle feeding, even though she physically can't breastfeed because they thought the evidence was so strong, she's on her own, she's not going to get any support. But when you look under the hood and you look at the data, you find the data is far less black and white than that. So why don't I start doing a talk at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and it's not about neither, it is about breastfeeding? Well, it's because there are actually a lot of takeaways from this which matter for economics, political science, and business. So the first thing is the idea that research is everywhere. So Daniel and I, our day job is to write academic papers and to scrutinize and review academic papers, and we've served as journal editors to accept or reject academic papers. Some of you might not go through life reading a single academic paper after your study. But what I'm trying to highlight here is these things matter. Even if you do not directly read the academic research, often we base our decisions on information that ultimately came from research, such as the advice to only breastfeed. It may well be that you pick up not an academic journal, but another type of magazine. Every time you pick up Men's Health Women's Fitness or Runner's World, you are reading about the findings of research. Maybe 7 months ago, you watched the London Marathon, you got excited, you want to enter it next year. Do I do high-intensity interval training? Do I do low-intensity steady state? That is all based on the idea of research. Maybe you want to improve yourself in other ways, not fitness. Maybe you want to develop a great skill. So as Daniel mentioned, Malcolm Gladwell has this 10,000 hours rule that you'll become amazing at the bass guitar if you just put 10,000 hours into it. But this research is actually not as clear and as conclusive as he will claim. Maybe you don't read stuff in your spare time because you already have that in your day job and in your studies. Maybe you listen to stuff. And if you listen to something, what better stuff to listen to than TED Talks? So this is the second most listened to TED Talk of all time by Amy Cuddy. She claims that if you're facing a difficult interpersonal situation like a job interview or public speaking, you do a power pose on the sidelines before the interview. This apparently releases endorphins into the bloodstream and leads to you acing the interview, but the research it was based on was actually flimsy and not replicated. So these things matter. Even if we're not academics, our decisions, our investments, our strategies as business leaders, they depend on information. The second is the truth is not enough. So what do I mean by this? Well, I'm really grateful to you all coming to a talk on misinformation because you might think misinformation is old news. In 2016, the year of the Brexit referendum, post-truth was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year. So we've known about misinformation for many, many years. But that is what I call level 1 misinformation, is that people say things which are clearly untrue, they can be falsified, so if somebody claims that Barack Obama is not a natural-born US citizen, you can show his birth certificate. But what is really subtle about this form of misinformation is that even if something is 100% accurate, it could still be misleading. So here, Google was not misrepresenting anything, because the actual paper said exactly what Google suggested. But it just only highlighted this. Without the top and the bottom, it didn't give the broader context, which is the actual paragraph said something quite different. There were other studies which found no significant effect. And let's say this was the all that the paper had. There were none of the contradictory studies. Even something like this could be misinformation. So, more breastfed participants had higher IQ scores. We read into this a causal relationship. We think breastfeeding led to the high IQ. Yet the actual statement, as written, doesn't imply any causality. There's only correlation. So you can't prosecute people for saying statements like this. Like, we always think misinformation is somebody else's problem. The government should prosecute people who spread misinformation. But actually, sometimes the source of misinformation is ourselves. We take correct statements, correct facts, we overinterpret and over-extrapolate from them. So this is why I wanted to write the book, is to empower the reader to address misinformation themselves by being able to notice things like this and not to be over-interpreting. And so why do we make these mistakes? It's not because we're dumb, it's not because we're bad people, it's because we are people. And if we're people, we suffer from biases, and by we, I absolutely mean me, because there's many instances in the book where I talk about my own mistakes with information. And one of the big biases is called confirmation bias. So this is the idea that we have a view of the world, and if we see something that supports that view, we latch onto it uncritically. And again, why? Because we're people. We have a brain has a striatum, and if we see something we like, it releases dopamine into the bloodstream. It just feels good, so we don't question it. Now, when you hear the word bias, you might think biases apply to really big issues. Maybe I'm biased about immigration, or gun control, or abortion, or climate change. But what I'm highlighting here is biases can be subtle. So something as subtle as thinking that natural stuff is better than man-made stuff led me to thinking that breastfeeding must be better than bottle feeding, and so I latched on to what I was told uncritically, even though I should know better, and I should know the difference between correlation and causation. So, what is the solution? My fourth point is to check everything. And by this, you might think, well, that's quite impractical. Do I really need to check everything? Because I'm a busy person, I don't have time to check every footnote. I don't have a PhD in statistics. And indeed, before I wrote the book, I read other books on misinformation, and they were good. I'm not going to criticize them because I see them as rivals. But they were so good and so comprehensive, they came up with the 267 ways you can be misinformed. And then it's challenging to remember them all and to put them into practice. So what I want to do is I want to break down misinformation into just 4 types. So we see the 4 again. And these 4 types I illustrate in something called the ladder of misinference. So why do I use a ladder? When we start from some statements and we draw some conclusions, we're climbing up a ladder, but I call this the ladder of misinference because sometimes the rungs are broken and we're making misinterpretations. So the first idea I've given you is that a statement is not fact, it may not be accurate. Google tells you that there's a clear link between breastfeeding and IQ, but if you read the rest of the paragraph, this is not always going to be clear. So even if the statement seems to be something where there's no misinformation here, they're reporting it as said, it is not accurate without the broader context. But what I want to highlight is that this is something which we see in many other areas. So what might be also important in terms of development, not just breastfeeding, but sleep. So this great book was really successful, sold millions of copies around the world, by Matthew Walker, who highlights how he has a PhD. So this means that everything he says must be true. And this is about the importance of sleep. And we want this to be true. We want an excuse to be an extra hour in bed. We want to believe that our over-eager colleague who wakes up at 5 a.m. is going to meet his or her comeuppance. And what might this be? Well, if they wake up so early, they might just end up sort of crashing into a table and getting injured. And indeed, that's what the evidence suggests, is indeed the more you sleep, the less likely you are to be injured. However, he takes this from an academic paper, and if you go to the underlying paper, it's actually a different graph. So the actual graph has another bar showing that if you sleep for 5 hours, you have fewer injuries than just 6 or 7. And so because he didn't want this, he just cut it out of his book and just ignored the evidence. And this is not just one example. There's an entire website devoted to all of the mistakes he makes in this book to misrepresent data. But this book is seen as the bastion of evidence for the power of sleep. Why? Because he's somebody who's said to have these credentials. And indeed, what he's reporting is not incorrect. He can't be prosecuted for it, but it's what he's hiding, which is the problem. Now, what could be even more important than sleep is life or death. So this is a paper about the opioid epidemic, which led to 2 million people dying around the world. So why is it that so many people were prescribed opioids when they're so addictive? Well, people didn't know they were addictive, because there's an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. It's been cited by 1,650 articles. And if we look at the article, yes, there was an article called Addiction Rare in patients treated with narcotics. But if you read it more carefully, what does it look at? It looks at if you've had 1 narcotic preparation. So maybe 1 doesn't get you addicted, but 4 or 5 might. And it also looks at hospitalized patients. Maybe if you're in a hospital and you're given this as a controlled substance, then you are not going to be addicted. But if you're an outpatient and you're given lots of opioids, maybe the pain is so bad that you consume 4 days painkillers on 1 day, that could lead to addiction. So these are all subtle forms of misinformation. Right here, even if this was completely truthful, a statement is not fact. Why? Because it doesn't apply in our particular context. They're looking at something quite different from what a doctor prescribing this as an outpatient will care about. So you might think, well, the solution is just to check the facts. What did the study actually show? Go to the underlying source and look at the bar chart. But that is not enough, because of the second concern, which are facts are not data, they may not be representative. So what I mean by this is even if something is 100% accurate, it may be misleading, it could be an outlier, it could be the exception that does not prove the rule. So I've talked about Amy Cuddy, but let's look at the second most viewed TED Talk, the third most viewed TED Talk of all time, which is by Simon Sinek. And this led to a global best-selling book, Start With Why. This is on how passion and purpose leads you to being successful. We all want this to be true. You tell your kids you can do anything you put your mind to. And you give facts to back this up. Apple started with Y, clearly successful, worth a $1 trillion, the first company to cross that, first company to be crossing $3 trillion. In the non-profit sphere, Wikipedia, clearly successful. This has surpassed the Encyclopedia Britannica as the world's fountain for knowledge. What about people? The Wright brothers, clearly successful. They all beat Samuel Pierpont Langley to launch the first test-powered flight. All of these are facts. Companies, organizations, people who became successful, so there's no fact in doubt. But even though these facts are true, they could be cherry-picked. What about the hundreds of other companies or people who also started with Y and failed? We never hear about them because they don't support Simon Sinek, so he's not going to tell us about them. This never sees the light of day. So what we'd want is something like a clinical trial. So we see some people who are sick, we give some of them a drug and see how many get better and how many get worse. Others we give a placebo, how many get better and how many get worse, and we compare the two groups. But importantly, our data set needs to contain those who took the drug and got worse. That is, companies that started with Y and failed, but we will never see them in a Simon Sinek book. We also want people who took the placebo and still got better, companies that did not start with Y and they still succeeded. Again, we won't see this in such books. We only see the facts that agree with the author's thesis. And even if those facts are 100% accurate, they're misleading because we don't see the full picture or the data. And again, this is why misinformation is so difficult to police. Even if what people say is true, it's what they're not saying, which is really where the action is. So you might think, well, the solution is just to make sure you have all the data. But even that is not enough because of the third misstep, which is data is not evidence, it may not be conclusive. So what do I mean by this? Because data and evidence are often used interchangeably. So what is evidence? So where do we hear that word often? In a criminal trial. So evidence is only evidence if it supports one conclusion and not others. So if the evidence suggests that Tom or Dick or Harry killed Sarah, that is not useful evidence. There's multiple suspects, but the evidence is only useful if it pinpoints one suspect, such as Tom. And this is the problem of alternative explanations. So let's go back to the data on breastfeeding and IQ. There's a strong correlation. One interpretation is breastfeeding causes higher child IQ, but there's the alternative suspect. Maybe there's common causes like family background which are causing both. So how does a time-pressed person without a PhD in statistics and not the ability to look up every footnote, how can you think about alternative explanations? Here's a simple tip. If you see something that you really want to be true, that your confirmation bias is urging you to accept and reshare and tweet from the rooftops, imagine you found the opposite result, the one that you don't want to be true. So imagine if the evidence suggests breastfeeding leads to lower IQ. Well, you don't like that because you want to think that natural stuff is always better. So you would try to shoot that down. And you would appeal to alternative explanations. You might appeal to family background. Maybe the women who are breastfeeding are poor. They can't afford they can't afford formula, and it's their poverty which leads to the lower child IQ. But now that we've alerted ourselves to the possibility of family background being a driver, ask ourselves, does it still apply, even though the relationship is in the direction that we want it to be? And so what this highlights is that the skills of discernment already lie within you. You don't need a PhD in statistics. I don't even have one myself. It's instead to use the discernment you already have. If I see on LinkedIn a study posted that people don't like the sound of, there is no shortage of comments as to why correlation is not causation, as to why it might be a few cherry-picked examples. But I don't see the same critical thinking when you see a study that everybody wants to believe, they lap it up uncritically. So the idea of imagine the opposite just encourages us to be as discerning about something we do like as something we don't. So the fourth and final misstep is evidence is not proof, it may not be universal. So what do I mean by this? What's the difference between evidence and proof? So a proof is universal. It applies everywhere around the world. So when Archimedes proved that the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared, that was true not only in ancient Greece in 3rd century BC, when he first found it, it's also true in 2024 in Holborn, London today. Whereas evidence is only true in a particular context. If the evidence suggested that Tom killed Sarah and Tom is the husband, it doesn't mean that every time a woman dies, it's always the husband who did it. And so this is a problem we make of over-extrapolation. So let's go back to the Malcolm Gladwell rule that Daniel kindly teed up. So if you're not familiar with this is the idea that you need to practice for 10,000 hours if you want to be an expert in anything. And by anything, he means anything. It could be chess or neurosurgery, any cognitively complex field. But if you look at the evidence that he cites, it's on violin playing. So violin playing is really different to all of these other things like bass guitar or neurosurgery. So what is true in violin playing is not necessarily true in chess or neurosurgery. But what if you got a study which is in the same domain that you care about? Are we home and dry? Well, the answer is unfortunately no, because of a problem called range. And to illustrate this, and this is my penultimate study, this is a great TED Talk, a great book by a UPenn psychologist professor on the importance of grit. So Angela Duckworth wanted to see, well, what causes you to be successful? And she claims it's grit, it's passion, it's perseverance, it's all the things we want to be true. And her landmark study looked at men and women who got into West Point, the US military academy. Now, if you get into West Point, you don't qualify to the military. You need to complete a 6-week physical training course known as Beast Barracks. And she wanted to see, well, what leads you to succeeding and surviving Beast Barracks? Well, what do you think it is? Most people think it's physical fitness. But she found it wasn't. And this is why she became so famous. What she found was grit was an even stronger predictor of completing Beast Barracks than physical fitness alone. And so that's why she was famous. For something physically demanding, grit was even more powerful. But the problem is something known as restriction of range. So if you are in West Point to begin with, you are already really fit. You had to be very fit to get in. And if there's diminishing returns to fitness, then fitness doesn't really make a difference. It has to be that other things like grit matter instead. But if you're a general person on the street who dreams of joining the military, maybe you should be working on your fitness, not your grit. What you see in a very small sample of very fit people doesn't apply to the general population. And just to illustrate this with one final study. If you had to jump from a plane because your plane is about to crash, would you want a parachute? Now you might think, what a silly question. Don't we all want parachutes? But parachutes cost money to make, and we care about the environment. Maybe they're made of plastic. So if we don't need parachutes, then that would save us some money. And so there was a randomized control trial in the British Medical Journal, which looks at do parachutes help if you have to jump? So they managed to get some volunteers, I don't know how. They got them to jump out of a plane, and some lucky people got a parachute. And others were randomly assigned to get no parachute at all and forced to jump. You think, well, how can this be ethical? But what they found was that parachutes had no effect on survival. So the same number of people died with parachutes as without. And before you think, well, this is horrific, let me assure you the number of people who died was 0, because the plane was on the ground. So the people jumped from a grounded plane. But this was a satirical study, but highlighted an important point, is range and context is important. What you see in a small range of jumps, which are 2 feet, if you find that parachutes don't make a difference with a 2-foot jump, you can't over-extrapolate and say, well, they're not going to make any difference at 10,000 feet. So I've thrown a lot at you in the past half hour. I'm actually, for once, ending early rather than just on time. So let me just sum everything up and then go to Q&A. So what were the 4 points? A statement is not fact. It may not be accurate. So check the underlying source. What was said? If it's a statement about breastfeeding, did the actual paragraphs confirm this, or were there actually contradictory remarks? If it was a graph, look at the underlying graph. Did it show what people were suggesting? And what was measured? Were we measuring something like one opioid dose when we care about multiple, and is it only for hospitalized patients, not outpatients? Now, clearly, you would be at your wit's end if every time you saw something you had to go up and check it, but for the really important things, that is where it really matters. So let's apply the 80-20 principle, so maybe the 20% of most important things are the ones you want to scrutinize. Second thing was facts are not data. They may not be representative. Do we have the full picture? Do we know about those with the secret sauce who failed? Companies that started with Y that went bankrupt? Or those without the secret sauce who succeeded, companies that hit it rich even though they had no Y? Data is not evidence. It may not be conclusive. Even if you have large-scale evidence, check for rival theories, alternative explanations, and one way to hook you to do this is to imagine the opposite result, the one that you don't like. How would you try to shoot it down? And finally, evidence is not proof. It may not be universal. Check the context. Was it in the setting that you care about? Is it in neurosurgery or violin playing? Check the range. Is it for really fit people when you care about the general population? Now, when you think about this, you might think, okay, this is a lot of work to do if I'm going to check everything. But just like anything, it gets easier the more you practice it. So when you first learn a tennis shot, you learn to do a split step, to take your body side, to do a backswing, follow through over your opposite shoulder. The first few times you do this, you always think about this deliberately. But after a time, this becomes commonplace. And this is also true with data. And also, why are we doing this? It's actually to allow ourselves to live more freely, not to constrain ourselves. Because when we become more questioning and more discerning, we hear that some of these mantras, like you are a bad mother unless you only breastfeed, or if you want to lose weight, you're never allowed to eat any chocolate, or you're never allowed to drink any alcohol, when you find that actually the data underlying some of these black and white statements is not as strong as people think, actually this allows us to live more freely rather than less. Well, thank you so much again for hosting me. It's been a pleasure to give this talk, and let me hand to Daniel for the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So now we're going to open the floor for questions. So please wait for the microphone to get to you, and I'll ask the microphone to go to you. And before you ask your questions, let us know your name and your affiliation if you have one that you want to share, of course. Okay, so please hands up on the back there. Yes, yes. I wanted the other one, but sorry.
Thank you very, very much indeed. The name's Ewan Grant, United Kingdom Defence Forum. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who, in training courses, used to teach the John F. Kennedy case. So I got it increasingly difficult to get across that context is everything. My question is, who is listening to you? Have you been invited to address scientists, government departments, whether in this country or elsewhere? Because I think a lot of people would benefit from hearing what you've just said, let alone reading the book. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for your kind comments. And this is how I actually ended up writing the book, because this is not part of my day job as a finance professor. So my first book, Growth Up, was exclusively about finance. But unusually, what I really enjoy as an academic is to engage with the public, to engage with practitioners about the findings of research. And that was what I was doing a lot about research in corporate governance and sustainable business. But what frustrated me is how people would respond to the research would depend on whether they liked its findings rather than its actual accuracy. So the things such as talking, say, in the UK Parliament, as Daniel mentioned, that was forums in which I was explaining what the evidence is. So I think I've been doing this sort of for many, many years, actually since I moved back to the UK about 11 years ago. And so even though the book is quite recent, it only came out in April, the whole idea of trying to highlight the truth and the evidence is something that I've tried to do for a while. And it's not just me, other academics have also tried to do this with the importance of research. But then specifically with this book, what is nice about it compared to my prior work, which is exclusively on finance, this is one which is going on sort of science or politics podcasts. I was on the Rory Stewart one recently and things like that. And hopefully these are issues which will then extend beyond my narrow field of economics to misinformation more generally. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, my name is Eugene. I'm a fourth year PPE student here at the LSE. I wanted to ask you a bit about your sort of like alternative solutions, because I'm worried that it might be too demanding to, ask people to fact check every single thing, even if you restrict it to like the most relevant facts for their lives. I'm worried that this is like most people don't have the time and energy for this, and that maybe shouldn't we be advocating for more systemic change? So changing the incentives that like news outlets and firms face, so that they don't sort of like report statements in this sort of like biased way and with this motivated reasoning.
Thanks so much for the question, and I would love an incentive-based solution. Both Daniel and I work on incentives in our academic research, but I think it's just difficult to change incentives because the incentives are so inherent for a social media company, because how do they get money? They get money from eyes on the screen, and how can they encourage you to stay on the screen? Because they feed you stuff that you like. So this is why we just like to live in an echo chamber, and we like to follow people who have similar views to us. It leads to the release of dopamine. So then this is why I do think that, even though obviously we'll try and do what we can do, so we might prosecute social media companies for spreading misinformation, I really think a lot of the onus is on us. And I actually challenge the idea that it is difficult and unrealistic to do, is that I think the idea of being discerning is something we already teach people when they're very young. So my son is going to be 3 this weekend. He already knows to be sort of doubtful and suspicious, not to accept sweets from strangers. Later we'll teach him not to get into a car from somebody he doesn't know. So the idea of being discerning is something that we learn at a young age. And then later in life, we know that if we don't like a study, we know how to attack it. We'll look at the sample size, we'll look at correlation v causation. And so we already have, I think, the tools to spot misinformation. It's instead our biases which are stopping us because we don't deploy the tools when we need to. We only deploy them selectively. And so given it's not an issue of skill or knowledge, but the willingness to apply this knowledge, I think that's something which can be overcome.
Hello, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I'm Kshitija. I have a PhD in economics, but right now my role, I lead a data science team in an investment bank. So I have run a lot of regressions during my academic stint, and I also run a lot of regression, rather machine learning models now. So what I think is one of the biggest differences what I have seen, the purpose of running regressions when we are in academia is exploratory. Basically, you are trying to explore the relationships. Whereas what we do in the industry when we run these machine learning models, the purpose is prediction. So we have a lot of test samples. So we have a trained sample and you would have multiple test samples. And in spite of running the results on multiple test samples, we still go wrong many times. So that's why after I have been playing this role, I always think about a lot of results like you pointed out, which I have seen in academic journals where you do not have a test sample. You just have one training set and you are exploring results, and that too quite reasonably small samples based on that. And these kind of biases are very likely to creep in. I don't know if, having more testing, test samples would change that. I don't know, but I see this as a stark difference.
Thanks very much for the comment, and I think I also share your skepticism as to having more test samples being the solution. I think it's more to be aware of the difference between descriptions and predictions. So regressions are good as a description of the world. So if you were to say, well, countries which begin with U have higher GDP, like the United Kingdom and the United States, that is a fair description of the world. But if you turn that into a prediction, if you change the name of your country so it starts with a U, will you improve your GDP? No. And so that's why I think my response to the earlier comment is, again, I'm not sure that the solution is sort of trying to get social media companies to change or to change the incentives, because even if they are presenting regressions correctly as descriptions, we like to turn them into predictions. Again, not because we're bad people. We want to improve ourselves, we want to give other people health advice, and so it might be on the correlation between breastfeeding and IQ which led to people trying to helpfully and with good intentions give the advice that you should exclusively breastfeed, even though that was not actually borne out in the underlying studies.
Yes.
I mean, thank you, Alex, for the wonderful insight that you've provided. I believe that currently the world that we live in, there are multiple self-help books that are available, and we need to fact-check the way that you've told us. But I'd like to point on to one particular aspect or one particular book. I've forgotten the author of it, but it was the IQ versus emotional intelligence. For example, the world that we live in is a world of technology and the world of social media. And what happens in majority of the cases, or what I felt, is that if there is something that is being presented and there's a good music that's hyping up that stuff, the motivation is there to believe in it. So what that book claimed was that one needs to build his emotional intelligence and prefer it over his IQ in order to cope up or get successful within the world. So what's your take on this debate between IQ and emotional intelligence?
So I'm not sure about the book you're referring to, but it sounds like a Daniel Goleman book. So he's written a lot about emotional intelligence. I think it's really important. I think it's really important for dealing with misinformation. So if somebody is not being able to be persuaded, if you'd like to persuade someone, what is the solution? Well, an IQ-only solution and the professor's solution is give them better data. So show them the best regression and show them your instrumental variable which has led to a causal claim. But that doesn't work because people are biased and people have their emotional reactions to it. So I think it's to understand the cultural context of information. So information is not in a vacuum. So let's take climate change. So why is it that so many people don't believe that climate change is real, despite highly informative documentaries like An Inconvenient Truth? That was a great documentary full of information. But it wasn't a great documentary because it was about Al Gore. And so that politicized the issue. That made some Republicans think, oh, well, actually, climate change is an issue that Republicans shouldn't believe in because Democrats believe in this. And so what is the solution? Maybe the solution is not to give Republicans more information about climate change, but to highlight that climate change is actually in accordance with Republican values. So if you say climate change is real, therefore we mean to tax companies and regulate them and subsidize clean energy, some Republicans don't like that. If instead, because climate change is real, we need human ingenuity and commercial innovation, such as launching solar reflectors into the atmosphere or coming up with ways to capture carbon and store it in deep geological formations. That is something that might be able to encourage people. So I think the emotional intelligence is recognizing we're not going to just rely on statistical purity, but also the meanings that come with the data and putting it in a way that people are going to be more receptive to hearing it. Because if they're not having their brain open, because of their biases blocking it out, it doesn't matter how good the data is, people are not listening.
So that gentleman over there with dark blazer, yes.
That's okay, if people can hear me. I think you've touched on it, Ben. I work for a health research funder. You touched on it in your answers to a lot of the questions that have been asked. What do you think the role of trusted institutions should be in dealing with this sort of misinformation and how we should be accessing it and making our own judgments?
So I think trusted institutions should help, particularly if they are institutions which are trying to promote freedom. So let's take LSE, so a great academic institution. I think the goal of an institution is to encourage academic debate. Sometimes it might be that the findings of research don't support what people want to be true. So it's not always the case that sustainability always improves performance, even though people like me would like that to be the case. And if there was indeed a paper which is showing that, then people should be able to publish that without fear of repercussions. Sometimes there might be hot button issues, so one of the things I work on is diversity, and there are some studies, there's work by a highly cited paper by Daniel and his co-author Renee Adams, that you don't always have a positive correlation between diversity and financial performance. That's an extremely influential article, yet it's often ignored by people with agendas who want to sort of claim that there's always a positive link to financial performance. So to one of the gentleman's earlier question, these are the things that I am taking when I'm appearing and discussing these with regulators. And so I think just to have the freedom to write about topics and show what the science says, and not to be sort of cancelled for being anti-diversity is really important. And then to the emotional intelligence point, you can say stuff like that, which is actually gender diversity does not always improve financial performance, not because you're anti-diversity, you're actually very pro-diversity, but you realise that diversity might be more than just gender and ethnicity, it might be cognitive diversity, socio-economic diversity, and so that's a way of tackling a thorny issue in a way which is going to make people receptive rather than defensive.
Right. Hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm head of analytics at Point Sigma, but I also used to be a journalist, so I'm going to play devil's advocate a bit here. Not saying journalists are devils, by the way. But so it's easy to publish something that's very nuanced and has a lot of context when you're writing the paper. When you're writing a story, for example, or a data story or a tweet, you're optimizing for attention and for a tagline, right? So how do you balance giving people complete information that has all of the context and everything, but also give them something they'll actually open? What do you think? Do you think you have any tips for people whose job it is to capture attention, who maybe also want to capture it and give context?
Thanks very much for the question. I think the 1-2 punch of a story backed up by large-scale evidence is really powerful. So I think where academics may fall short is they think, okay, if I just present the greatest regression, which has got the best econometrics, people will believe that, but people listen to stories. So we grew up with an oral tradition, that was true thousands of years ago, stories are memorable. And I think the alternative of just relying on stories, that's problematic because you can always have a story to support whatever you want to support. I'm sure I could find one person who smoked a lot and lived to 100 years old. And so I think it's the 1-2 punch of the story but backed up by large-scale evidence, such as maybe my story about trying to feed my son, which might be an emotive story which is going to be resonating, but it's backed up by large-scale data on the link between breastfeeding and intelligence. So I think those combinations can be quite powerful, rather than just one in isolation.
Hi, Alex. I'm Anil Kashyap from the University of Chicago. I've got a question about kind of cost-benefit. So in almost all cases, demand curves slope down. You raise the price, demand goes down. How much energy should we spend fact-checking that when my guess is in the cases where that's not statistically significant, probably outweigh the number of times that demand curves slope up? So can you say more about how you actually make your 80-20 thing into practice when there is kind of strong evidence in one direction?
Yeah, so it may be that not everything in life is going to be nuanced. So there are certain things where the evidence might be pretty close to one way, and that is my reading of the evidence on climate. And so how might you get that? You might get that through looking at scientific consensus. So how can you get to scientific consensus? On a topic like economics and finance, you can read a review article, so they will explore the literature more generally. In medicine, you have something like Cochrane reviews. So in some cases, it may be that you don't need to do this yourself. It can be that there's experts which have done this, and you can sort of stand on the shoulders of giants. If you don't have something like a Cochrane review to stand on, I think it's just the importance of the issue to you. So something like breastfeeding and child development, that might be important to me, but am I going to look at, is football better for my kids' development than rugby? I might not think that as a material issue. Also, if it's something where you might think there's quite strong confirmation bias, and so the evidence that you might see could be quite selective, it might be, say, the data on sustainability and performance, on diversity and performance. That's where I was seeing mostly data always on one side, and it seems that that's something which people are latching onto and sharing. That's why I chose to look more specifically at the actual rigour of the research which was being presented.
Thank you very much. My name is Ben Norman. I was a student here many years ago. I'm now at the Bank of England, but I'm here in a personal capacity. I suppose my question builds on the previous questioner and also some of the other themes that have come up. I came into this talk looking at your title with my own bias, which I recognised, which was I originally studied medieval history, and over the years I've thought that actually it's historians who question the biases of their sources who are a key element as a sort of antidote to a post-truth world. And so I was surprised not to hear any of that in what you presented. I actually really like the sort of methodical ladder model that you've got. And I suppose what I'm wondering is, can the sort of questioning of the biases of the sources be part of the answer to your 80-20 sort of heuristic, how to sort of sift out what you don't need to then go through your ladder with?
Yeah, this is a really good point. And so what I go to in chapter 9 of the book is how an individual can sort of think critically without having to apply all of those checks. Can we stand on the shoulder of giants here? So one thing I talk about is peer review, the extent to which we can rely on the peer review process. And just a sort of summary to that is it's good. It's not perfect, but perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. It's better to look at something checked than something unchecked. Peer review doesn't always work, but it is still a kite mark and one particular check. But another thing we can look at is the credentials of the authors, and the characteristics of the authors. And there's two characteristics that matter, which are credentials and bias. So what might their credentials be? It's their expertise in that particular topic. So if you have something which is hot button, it might be COVID, you could have lots of doctors who are starting to speak out on that, even though their expertise might be cardiology rather than epidemiology. But also bias. And so one thing that you might ask yourself is, would the people have released the opposite result? So let's say as an academic working on diversity and financial performance, we want to release whatever the data shows. So there's many academics which show that diversity has no positive effect, and there are still some which say that it has positive effects, so either one can go. Whereas would the High Pay Centre ever release a report showing that CEOs are not excessively paid? No, I think they're looking at advocacy rather than research. Now, it doesn't mean that what they say is always going to be false. Sometimes what they want to be true is actually true. But if, as Anil was suggesting, well, where do we want to focus our efforts? If it is a source where they're only likely to present one particular result, then we might be particularly discerning about them.
Okay, so first I know that many more people want to ask questions, and I apologize if I haven't called you. There are still many people who want to do it, but we have, our time is up, so I would just like to thank Alex for his presentation. I want to remind everyone that, again, he will be signing copies, and the book is available for sale here, I believe. So, Alex, thank you again.
Thank you so much.